You really need to take time to appreciate the small things in life, like how after fighting through thousands of undead and literally saving Torchlight, it's important to make time to just go fishing. Welcome to Worst ARPG Ever, a series where I play every ARPG in an attempt to find the worst. Today we're going to be looking at Torchlight, a game which spawned 3 sequels to date and possibly more in the future. I'll start by jumping right into the new player experience, talk about the game's systems as they come up, and then, if I make it to Endgame, get into that a little bit as well. Now, if you want to see what other series could be the worst ARPG ever, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, but for now, get ready because things could get a little bit nostalgic. After all, Torchlight came out in 2009, which is basically ancient history. And this is also where we get to the first problem the game has. I needed to remap keybinds, and that's a problem because there's no way to remap keybinds within the game itself. Given that the game has been continually sold and supported across multiple platforms, it's a little strange to me that this was never added as an option later. So after some incredibly intense work, I managed to recode the entire game to support custom keybinds. No, I'm just kidding, I'm not that good at coding. In fact, I'm not good at coding at all. I just Googled and found out that it's a text file, and after researching a few obscure Java codes, well, the wiki had a good page on that, so I managed to get everything sorted. Unfortunately, a few features didn't seem to have a keybind in the text file, and couldn't be remapped. Luckily, this was never an issue throughout my playtime. And so with that issue sorted, let's get started. Now initially, the game's presentation is lovely. It feels old-timey in a way that reminds me of a lot of games that I played when I was young. Maybe if you grew up in a different era or played different games, it won't be quite as nostalgic. But right off the bat, things felt very cozy, almost like being at home. The narrator also does a really good job of hiding some loading screens, which makes the game feel a lot more immersive.
I've arrived in Torchlight and begun my exploration of the tunnels below. These mines are vast and aglow with ember. I've never seen so rich a vein.
I know, I'm just loading into another level here, but I'm hearing about Alaric and his quest, or maybe his misadventures, as he journeys deeper into the mines in search of a source of ember. Speaking of a narration, I rather enjoyed the way that the narrator informs you that you've picked up a quest, completed a quest, or turned in a quest. It's a lot better than those obnoxious quest complete pop-ups, or weird little golden lines pointing to your next objective. You could open the quest log, but to be honest, the narration did such a good job that I never actually needed to open the quest log. I only found out this was a thing much later when a quest bugged out and I wanted to abandon it. So my mission is to enter the mines, aid What's-His-Face who ran off to commit heroics, and figure out what's going on with all these monsters. Combat is simple enough. Left click to attack, and right click for special. The game tells you to click a potion when you get to low health or mana. You can keybind them, but this is the era we're dealing with, back when clicking wasn't considered a war crime. But don't worry, using potions when you reach low health or mana is going to become very relevant later. This was when I noticed something about combat that's really important. It's just satisfying. It might be that I'm only critting for 20, but damn, that's the best 20 I've ever crit for outside of D&D. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it's the combination of the bright colors, the chunky text, and some surprisingly solid sound design, but I was very satisfied with my early combat experience, and even though there weren't very many enemies on screen, nor were the enemies I was fighting particularly difficult, it just felt great. Although attacking them wasn't quite as good, because the hitboxes are extremely clunky. You default to the biggest object, and when there aren't that many enemies on screen, it's not the worst. When there are a lot of enemies on screen, targeting a specific one is near impossible. Also, sometimes, it was easier to target or click on a door than it was to click on an enemy or item. While it didn't get me killed very often, it was a fairly continual source of frustration, one of a few that I encountered throughout my entire playthrough actually. Early on, I rectified this by really focusing in on my special. The right click ricochets off terrain, making it easy to damage enemies or AoE down entire groups, even if I couldn't actually effectively click on a single enemy or determine the hitbox.
Quest complete.
So after completing my quest, I was told to go back to town. But damn it, I want to explore a little bit more. I mean, I just got into these mines, and there's got to be more loot around here somewhere. So that's exactly what I did. And surprise, surprise, I did find some more loot. But then I found the door down to the next stage. Decided, you know what, maybe now is the time to go back to town, just like the quest says, and turn things in. Back in town, we get another quest, and I also spent a little bit of time looking around the various vendors that you have. Enchanting, gambling, yep, there's a lot of ARPG staples here. Everything's nicely explained and feels really intuitive. But it's important to remember, this is one of the games that influenced the isometric or Diablo-like ARPG genre. So a lot of what it seems intuitive to me or you today actually probably needed an explanation back then, where gamers were a lot more familiar with other types of RPGs or non-Diablo-like ARPGs, and Torchlight kind of fell in that middle ground, where it was a little bit of a hack and slash game and a little bit of a Diablo game. So here's a speedrun of explaining all the various NPCs and the game systems. Enchanting. You have a random chance to improve the item. Sometimes there's a random chance to do nothing, and occasionally there's a random chance to disenchant things. Disenchanting your item is bad. Gems. There's 2 vendors here. One saves the gem and destroys the item. The other saves the item and destroys the gem. In general, if you get a good gem, you'll probably want to save it, whereas if you have a really good item and a weak gem, then you want to save the item. The Gambler allows you to buy random items from a vendor. This didn't seem super useful, as the other vendors in town sold pretty good items, and the Gambler seemed quite expensive for what he gave me. Or maybe I was just unlucky / don't like to gamble. Then you can buy spells and jewelry, along with maps, which is kind of a mid/endgame activity. Or you can go to general goods and buy a lot of potions. Last up on the left, you've got the weapons and armor vendor, who I stop by frequently because I found very rare items, including set pieces, at this vendor with a decent amount of frequency. Last up, the transmuter. Random recipes. I mostly just use this to upgrade gems. There were a few things that it said it could do in terms of combining gear. I tried random combinations, nothing worked, and then I went back to upgrading gems. But anyway, back to the portal, into the mines we go. On level 2, there's a diverse set of enemies, and they even have actual mechanics. So I had to spend some time dodging orbs, kiting, and dealing damage. Overall, it went pretty well, though I noticed the enemies were definitely getting a lot more dangerous. They weren't killing me instantly or anything, but I had to pay attention, which kept the combat interesting and, overall, provided a nice bit of tension. This wasn't just a jolly jaunt in the mines, after all. And oh look, fishing! This is definitive proof that Torchlight is an MMO. So I spent a little time sitting down fishing to see what I could get. I was expecting fish that I sold for money and went back to town. But no, there's fish that transform your pet into a monster. Don't worry, from my experience, this isn't super relevant. It's definitely nice to use as a bonus occasionally, but most of the time, you're going to be sending your pet back to town to sell loot, which means the pet's unavailable and thus the transformation doesn't really matter. Also, it has about a 2-minute duration except for some really rare fish, so I found myself kind of sitting on it and stockpiling consumables. This was probably my loss, but ultimately that's what I did for most of my playthrough. Continuing on and fighting my way through a lot of definitely not kobolds, I finally caught up with What's-His-Face. He's pretty proud, but not too proud to accept help, which is good because I was going to help him anyway. With my pet and the NPC acting as distractions, I was able to rain absolute devastation down on the remaining foes, which led to steady progress. It certainly helped that a lot of the kobold-type enemies panicked and fled when I killed their allies, which is perfectly understandable, but also unusual in video games. Usually when you kill someone's ally, the monster just mindlessly runs at you, because it doesn't really care. That guy wasn't his friend, and after all, it was just the wind. Like I said before, they really nailed combat and made it satisfying even early on, in a way that many modern games struggle to replicate. And I think this is partially because there was no nagging, "What about getting to Endgame? You should go as fast as possible," in the back of my mind. I wasn't thinking about Endgame. I was thinking about the here and now, and the gameplay definitely benefited from that. As I continued on, my fame increased. The game told me I was now unremarkable, an achievement that somehow doesn't feel worth celebrating. I mean, I always knew deep down I was unremarkable, but it hurts just a little bit when a game tells you that. But hey, when you increase your fame, you get a skill point, so at least being insulted by the game was useful. With my newly allocated skill points, I moved on and found the first boss battle. We confront Alaric, and Brink, becomes corrupted. I see where this is going. Yep, the first boss we fight is a corrupted Brink. He had a few mechanics, most of which were pretty easy to avoid by standing back and killing his crystals. He had quite a bit of health, but not so much of a fight felt unreasonable. So after a bit, unfortunately, I did manage to defeat him. And so the quest to cure ourselves begins, because while we didn't transform into a monster immediately, we were infected with the same ember, and it's just a matter of time before we go all spiky and start talking about how we need to destroy the world. So after taking a trip back to town to, of course, sell my loot, I got a quest to what looks like a random dungeon. This includes several different enemy types, and with a single floor, it's pretty quick and had good loot. It was about this point where I started to pay attention to the items that I was vacuuming up. It seemed like white was the lowest or most common rarity, then green, then blue, and after blue items, it went on to yellowy-orange uniques or purple set pieces. For the first time, my health got really low, and the game had a nice warning letting me know that I should probably be using a potion. So I did, then continued on and cleared out the rest of the dungeon. I'm sure there's going to be more quests from that guy later. But back to the main quest for now. Returning to the main quest, I realized I may have made a small mistake. The enemies were level 4. How cute! So many levels below me. By doing side quests, I managed to over-level myself. So it was probably better to continue on the main quest for a bit and go do the side content later. Luckily, this didn't have any long-term impact, so it wasn't too big of a deal. It was, however, around now that I noticed something. I wasn't able to respec, so all of my choices were permanent. I decided that I was going to be a bow-ranged attack character, or I guess gun-ranged attack character since I was getting more guns than bows. That meant that I needed to invest into dexterity. I decided to go with a 3-to-2 ratio, just because in a lot of games, 3-to-2, offense to defense, tends to work quite well. I also couldn't respec my skills, so I just went with what I had and continued to put points in. Luckily, I was getting skill points at a generous pace, so I wasn't too concerned about making mistakes, even if I couldn't respec. After all, a lot of things just weren't all that relevant to my build. When it came to choosing equipment, I also didn't pay that close attention to the stats. I just went with the shiny ones that had more lines of text. Resistances in life seemed good for defense, armor was of course useful, and anything that said adds damage was probably good enough for now. But unlike in many other games, chests are not free loot. They're often trapped. Trapped chests deal damage, spawn enemies, or if you're really lucky, they're actually a mimic. And on top of trying to chomp your arm off, mimics drop quite a few items. I was both slightly mad at the fact that a mimic almost got me once, and quite happy to see them afterwards, though I definitely shot all the chests that could have been mimics. It's a trick I learned from Dark Souls. Shoot all your chests and you'll never be surprised by a mimic again. Now, as you progress, you'll also notice hidden rooms, many of which have a mini puzzle. Hit a few levers in the right order, light a light, that sort of stuff, which not only helps the game feel a little bit more immersive, but it's loot, therefore awesome. Continuing along my journey, I came across another boss battle. The Sisters, 3 shades, and this was by far the hardest fight yet. With the power of kiting, though, I managed to prevail, because when the Sisters were together, they were almost unstoppable. One was healing the others. They did a lot of damage. But if I kited around, 2 got stuck on the lower level, and 1 was off by herself on the upper level. A heal did unfortunately get off and extend the fight by a little bit. But after I made quick work of her, I was able to take out the healer, and then the last sister wasn't too much of a threat by herself. Oh boy though, if I knew what was coming for me, I definitely would have taken this fight more seriously. And so far, I felt like the game was progressing at a really good pace. So I continued down through the next few levels until on level 8 I encountered the game's second real boss. Yeah, as it turns out, the sisters that I thought were a boss fight because there's 3 of them were actually just mini bosses. The Overseer fight was incredibly hectic. It felt like at any moment I was going to get overrun and I just didn't have enough AoE damage. But slowly I chipped away the skeletons protecting him and persevered, which was really satisfying. Again, there was just that right level of difficulty where I felt like my life was in danger. I felt like things were on the brink of going out of control, but I never actually died. I never failed, while still getting close enough to feel challenged. Oh yeah, and the Overseer dropped an item, his eyeball, that, if consumed, permanently increases your stats. It's a disgusting job, but someone's got to do it. So after eating an eyeball, on to the Dwarf Fortress. Or actually, on to another side zone quest, and then the Dwarf Fortress, where I noticed these side zones were significantly more difficult than the main quest. And so I decided to grind a little bit more EXP and prepare for what was to come by using the map object. Maps feel a little bit more like a puzzle dungeon. The spider at the end was a bit disappointing, as I thought the boss battle would be more than just a bunch of spiders. But hey, the area was much smaller and bite-sized, so it was a nice change of pace. At which point I found out the Dwarf Fortress wasn't actually after the Overseer. Yeah, no, that's going to be later, don't worry. Instead, it was a jungle area, which I'm not sure how I feel about it. There were a lot of poison enemies, and generally that's my least favorite part of a given game. So I needed to recover 3 glyphs, reactivate the Waygate, and progress. I like how the missions you're doing change up just slightly. Sure, it's not entirely different from what I was doing before, killing enemies and progressing through levels, but instead of going down, I was now going horizontally and then down. I also liked that every time I entered a new area, there were new enemies and quite a bit of variety between them. But this is also where the gameplay experience didn't end up changing that much. I continued down for several more levels, and I noticed each area followed the same formula. There were new enemy types, some of which had different powers, there were more ranged enemies that had different attacks, and you'd finish up the series of 4 floors with a boss fight. Throughout, hitting enemies did remain a frustration, even when I changed up my skills, cycling through and ultimately settling on Explosive Shot. Oftentimes, I'd find upgrades that were slightly out of my level range, which is maybe bad in terms of my inventory space, but once I learned to send my pet to town frequently, it wasn't all that bad, and I could always use a portal to hop back to town and put the item in my stash. It also meant, though, that I always had something to look forward to. I was, level 14, but by level 16, I'd have a new gear upgrade. Then before I knew it, I was 17 and trying to get a little bit more EXP for that upgrade at level 18. It was also about halfway through this journey that I learned something. Potions effectively and easily recovered my mana, so mana costs are basically just a tax on poor people. From here on out, I spent a significant portion of my funds on mana potions, because this let me spam my skills and made the gameplay way more enjoyable. With every good revelation, well, there may also be a bad revelation, because as I progressed down, I encountered Dark Zealots. In my notes, I have one thing about Dark Zealots. Fuck Dark Zealots. They do an insane amount of damage. And at first I thought this was just me lacking lightning res, because when I first encountered them, I had about 50. I thought that was pretty good. I assumed that it goes up to like 75, same as PoE rules. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. I then improved my lightning resistance from 50 to around 250, and the Dark Zealots still continued to wreck me with their lightning bolts. So yeah, I'm going to say that Dark Zealots are a stupid enemy and really the only thing that felt kind of bullshit. I don't know how much lightning resistance I would need to actually resist their bolts. They did a 5 Poison Nova Barrage thing as well that had pretty scary tracking, but at least that one I could dodge, or half the time it kind of just got eaten by my pet, which wasn't too concerning. Don't report me to PETA. And this was where I started to die a little bit. Not to most enemies, but definitely to Dark Zealots. This is also where I learned you have 3 choices on death. The first is you can choose to give up your experience and fame and immediately respawn. The second is to choose and give up some gold, but start at the beginning of a level. The third is you spawn back in town but lose nothing, which, as it turns out, if you have a portal open, means you lose nothing except for the portal scroll. Turns out, just like mana costs, death was only really a tax for poor people. And so I bought some extra portal scrolls and kind of sort of corpse hauled through the next level. As I continued through the Dark Fortress, the enemies got more demonic and a little bit more draconic. I hadn't really been paying too much attention to the story, as you could probably tell from my narration. When I reached the end of level 34, I definitely paid attention, because there was Ulrich, the guy I'd been chasing the entire time, and I had some revenge to commit against him, so I began committing revenge. The fight ended up being surprisingly easy. I don't know if my character was just overpowered for this fight, or if this fight was supposed to be easy, though I very much expect the latter because of my next experience, where, after completing level 34, I entered level 35, and finally, after 35 floors below Torchlight Mountain, I found Ordrak, the source of all the corruption. It was time to end this once and for all. And I feel like Ordrak was supposed to be an epic battle, but either my build was really bad or he had way too much health and way too many adds. So instead of being an epic struggle for survival, it ended up being very, very, very long. But the ads were dropping so many potions that I was easily able to keep my health and mana up. When I say a very long fight, I mean it took me 25 minutes. I could show you all of it, but I don't think anyone deserves that. But right about 25 minutes in, when the boss was at 10% health, I got stuck. I'd been trying to move, but I kept clicking on enemies by mistake. This is why walk to move should be a default feature in every ARPG. And I died, and my heart sank because in that moment I knew the boss was going to reset. And as I was staring at the death screen, I noticed he hadn't reset. So you know what? Forget it. I had the XP, I don't need that. I had fame, who needs fame? After all, wasn't the game telling me that my fame was irrelevant? No. I had one mission and I was going to do it. So consequences be damned, I resurrected on the spot and immediately dumped everything into Ordrak. And I won. I defeated him. Ordrak was down, Torchlight was saved. And now I had a lot of loot to collect. Because if I'm going to fight an enemy for 25 minutes, you better be sure that I'm going to collect every single gold piece worth of loot to really get my money out of a fight. And so, that's exactly what I did. Now overall, Torchlight did a really good job of giving me a sense of consistent progression. I felt like I was always finding upgrades, and because they were just 1 or 2 levels out of reach, it was an achievable goal. Within that play session, I knew I was going to get those levels. I knew I had something to look forward to, and roughly how long it would take me to get there. Also, as you were going down through each zone, the game changed up biomes and enemies roughly every 4 levels, which certainly helped to keep things from getting monotonous. And sure, maybe there's not that much of a difference between a skeleton with a shield, a lizard man with a shield, or a goblin with a shield. But they looked visually different, and so my goopy gamer brain was definitely tricked into thinking these were different enemies that I was fighting. And overall, it was really darn smooth all the way down until I hit Dark Zealots. They were a massive wall, and I corpse-hauled through it. I'm not proud of it, but I got to Ordrak. I do feel like the fight was a little long, but I also feel like the setup was pretty darn epic. The way he was summoning so many enemies that you were always feeling overwhelmed would have been really cool if the fight had been about a third of a length, and who knows, maybe I just needed a build of higher DPS. Now usually, when I go into an older game where I don't have a lot of nostalgia, I find the experience to be vaguely irritating, just because the game's lacking a lot of the quality of life features you'd have today. But instead, I didn't really find that in Torchlight. I suppose yes, a little bit with the enemy targeting, but aside of that, it felt really smooth and easy to play. And so I can absolutely see why this was a lot of people's first ARPG. Hell, if this had been the first ARPG I'd played, then I would have played it a ton as well. Because once you reach floor 35 and defeat Ordrak, Torchlight may be saved, but the world hasn't ended. There's a few things left yet to do. 2 things specifically. Number 1, you can enter the Crypt, an endless dungeon where you go down infinitely. Now this could just be luck because I didn't go down that many levels, but I did notice that I was frequently getting high rarity items such as uniques and set pieces. Also, during post-campaign gameplay, I was looking for sets and uniques, and while I found quite a few of them, it was very satisfying to combine them and wear what felt like a pretty epic set of gear. Because remember, I built defense and dex, but often needed strength and magic for some of the items, so I found myself grabbing a lot of attributes on jewelry. And this is how the gameplay continued, clearing the dungeon or maps, and moving on to fight ever harder enemies. Within the first few levels, I didn't notice a severe rampant difficulty, though the Dark Zealots did remain terrifying/annoying. I have no idea how much lightning res you need to not get zapped by them. And as I continued, I found I was replacing my gear a little less often and enchanting it a little more. Enchanting is a cool system whereby you can improve pretty much any item. I don't know the exact rules for it, but it definitely seems like you can use it even on high rarity stuff like uniques. It would just suck if any of my main pieces got disenchanted. Luckily, none of them did, so I was pretty happy with that. You'll also find shrines of enchantment occasionally along your journey. Much like mana shrines or life shrines, these offer a one-time benefit. You put an item in and get a free enchantment. It has all the same rules where it can disenchant nothing can happen, or it can add new power to your item. And I really like this, because when you get a mana shrine or a life shrine, sure, it's nice to restore your resources, but there's no long-lasting effect. Whereas if you get lucky or significantly unlucky with an enchanting shrine, oh, that's going to matter for quite a few levels, especially if you disenchant your main weapon, which again, luckily didn't actually happen, though I'm sure it would just be a matter of time and a matter of statistics. The other endgame system is the path that I didn't take, Rebirth, where you get to make a new character, pass along an heirloom, and know that your character, the hero who fought through all of Torchlight, heroically took an arrow to the knee, settled down, and decided to live the quiet life. Or potential lore implications aside, you get to play through the game again, and loop things for fun or profit, fight higher level enemies, use more epic items, yada yada yada. And so, after reaching floor 35, defeating Ordrak, and exploring some of the post-endgame content, I think now is a good time to wrap up a review. First up, Torchlight felt really different from Diablo. When you enter a Diablo game, the world is harsh and hostile. Everything wants to kill you and is fully capable of doing so. On the other hand, Torchlight gives off a warm, almost welcoming ember glow. The more cartoony graphics and chunky text makes the game really fun to play even at low levels, and it's simple enough that someone who wasn't a hardcore ARPG fan could easily get into this game. The only thing that was really unforgiving was that your choices couldn't be changed, though I'm sure at this point there's a mod to fix that. Luckily, it never seemed to really come back to bite me. I suppose there were a few times where I wish I could have equipped an item, but I was 40 strength short or something, but for a lot of things I only needed like 20 strength, which was easy to get on jewelry, and for skill points I just kind of had enough. I maxed out all the things that were relevant. I even put 10 points into something that didn't end up being very good. Fire Trap. I thought it was a really cool thing, until I learned that all the important enemies that I wanted to kill with it, that I hoped to have passive damage for, were resistant to fire. But hey, Explosive Shot still worked, and that worked like a charm, so ultimately no harm done despite being down about 10 skill points. Something else I really liked was the way you always had upgrades to look forward to. You knew something good was going to drop within the next level. You could easily compare DPS on weapons to find an upgrade, and if something was almost good enough, well, try enchanting it, maybe you'll roll into something really nice. I found the enchanting system was very good because it encouraged you to upgrade your existing items instead of replacing them outright. And again, because items often dropped slightly higher level than me, but within an achievable range, I always felt like I was making steady progression, and I always felt like I had something to look forward to. It was also always exciting to come across a portal beast. This is effectively Torchlight's version of a loot goblin, but instead of it just being a thing that tries to run away, which you chase down and murder for loot, instead it was a portal beast that kind of phased around a little bit, and after you murdered it, you got to go into a portal zone, which is a dungeon brimming with loot. And nothing says cut. And nothing warms an ARPG player's heart like a dungeon brimming with loot for you to pick up. I often found epic items, set pieces, all that fun stuff in there, and it was a blast. So every time I came across one, I was like, yep, I'm getting in that portal immediately. It was a really fun twist, and I'm very happy it's part of the game. Now, ultimately, I didn't end up playing the endless dungeon for that long. Without the driver of a main story, I kind of felt satisfied with wrapping up Torchlight. I'm sure there's plenty of content to keep going with, plenty of levels to gain, plenty of sets to combine, and if you really wanted to min-max your character, then you absolutely could. But if I was going to do that, I'd probably want to go in, look up a guide, find a really optimized build, and see how far I can take it. Instead, for my little bit more casual delve, I was quite happy with everything I achieved and thoroughly enjoyed the experience. The hitbox issue was annoying, and it does make targeting enemies with certain types of attacks irritating. Luckily, Explosive Shot hit in a wide radius, so if I couldn't hit an enemy, all I'd need to do is aim for a wall near them. And other skills like Ricochet or Rain of Arrows similarly could be aimed in the general proximity of an enemy without having to hit them directly. Oh, and Dark Zealots suck. Let the record reflect that Dark Zealots really suck. However, those few small gripes aside, I don't really have many other complaints, and I was genuinely impressed with how well the narration, tutorialization, and graphics held up for a game that came out in 2009. Going with stylized art instead of making it gritty and realistic was absolutely a great move. And so in closing, I give Torchlight a death penalties and mana costs are for poor people out of 10. With that, I'm curious, what do you think of Torchlight? Was it your first ARPG, or are you just looking at the game now? If you're looking to pick it up, I think you can find it on sale on Good Old Games, Epic Games, or Steam fairly frequently. Out of the 3 platforms, I'd recommend Steam so that you can download some mods and maybe fix clunky issues like not being able to respec or not having an option for keybinds. I didn't actually look to see if there were mods to fix those things. I'm just going to assume there are because this is a fairly old and well-loved game. Plus, the original creators of Torchlight, while no longer part of Runic Games, are still working on ARPGs, so look forward to another title there. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out Worst ARPG Ever, Episode 1, which focused on Hero Siege 2.0, a game I had significantly less fun with because it copied Diablo badly. But I'll leave that up in the card and down below for your viewing pleasure. With that said, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. If you want to see more episodes of Worst ARPG Ever, you can support using the link below for as low as $1 a month. But that's all for me today. I'm going to go back to spamming some potions now to ignore my mana costs, but in conclusion, I can definitely say Torchlight wasn't the worst ARPG ever, and I'll see you again soon for the next episode where we may find the game that is.